You know, it's interesting the twists and turns that life sometimes takes. And this evening I happen to find myself introducing two of my former Washington Post editors. Fortunately for them, I guess, I had great experiences with them and consider them among the most talented journalists I ever worked with. So I have only nice things and nice memories to recall, nice things to say. For one thing, they both really know Europe, and I'm sure we're in for a very informed and enlightening discussion this evening about the current state of events there and the consequences for Americans. Bill Drozdiak's new book, Fractured Continent, is especially timely given the various crises confronting Europe at the moment. There's Britain's move to leave the EU, the refugee surge and backlash to it, Russia's aggression in Ukraine and elsewhere on the continent, and the renewed strength of authoritarian, populist, and nationalist alternatives, just to name a few of the disruptive trends on the other side of the Atlantic. Compounding matters, of course, that the Trump administration is pursuing in America's first agenda that calls into question U.S. security guarantees and existing trade pacts and is straining ties with European allies. Bill's own experiences in Europe span more than 4 decades and have made him an exceptionally knowledgeable and astute observer of developments there. He first moved from the U.S. to Europe in the 1970s to play professional basketball. When you see him, you'll understand how that makes a lot of sense. He first moved after about 7 years of that. He found his way into journalism initially as a stringer in Europe for the Washington Post, then at Time Magazine as a State Department reporter. Later based in Cairo and Beirut, he covered the Middle East for Time and the Washington Star before reuniting with the Post, where he stayed 20 years doing stints in several European capitals and taking a turn as the paper's foreign editor. After that, Bill embarked on a career in the nonprofit world that helped to deepen his own views of Europe. He served as founding executive editor of the German Marshall Fund office in Brussels, and later moved to New York to become president of the Atlantic Council on Germany. And nowadays, he's affiliated both with the Brookings Institution and the consulting firm McClarty Associates here in D.C. Jim Hoagland, who's going to be in conversation with Bill this evening, has also had quite an illustrious career in journalism that has taken him all over the world. Arriving at the Post in 1966, he started by covering metro and national affairs, but within a few years he was sent abroad, first to Africa, then the Middle East, and after that Paris. He returned to Washington to oversee the paper's foreign coverage for a number of years, then moved to Paris in the mid-1980s to start a column on foreign affairs. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for international reporting and the other for commentary. Interestingly, it was Jim, as the Post's Paris correspondent, who gave Bill his first reporting job as a stringer. And then years later, Jim helped bring Bill to the Washington Post for full time. So please join me in welcoming Bill Drozdiak and Jim Hoagland.
It's a real pleasure to be here with you this evening and to be with my old friends and colleagues, Brad Graham and Bill Drozdiak. One of the first things you learn when you show up as a journalist in Paris is the French saying that journalists use to each other, which is "Cher collègue, n'aie-moi ami," which means dear colleague, but nonetheless my good friend. That's a very French approach to things, and in this case, it's absolutely true of both Brad and Bill, who made the foreign editor's life much easier by being the very good correspondents they were. it's true that Bill Drozdiak is the only person I ever had to hire twice, because he came into my office in Paris in 1977, wanting to try out a career in journalism. And we talked for half an hour or so, and I decided he had the stuff to be a good journalist. And then I hired him back after he dallied with time very briefly, and he became an outstanding correspondent for us in Bonn, Berlin, and Paris. He, in fact, replaced Brad Graham in Bonn. But we're here really to talk about his book more than his illustrious career. So I want to get to the fractured continent that Bill has chosen to describe it as today, which is quite a different way of describing it than American presidents in recent years have spelled out the ambitions for American policy, at least toward Europe. One of the things I like about the book, Bill, is how you show the importance to Americans of what happens in Europe and the importance to Europeans of what happens in America. The first Bush administration at the end of the Cold War, in the last days of the Cold War, talked about Europe whole and free as the ambition for American policy. You describe it as a fractured continent. Clearly, things have not turned out exactly as American presidents have wanted. How would you rate American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War in producing positive results in Europe?
Thank you, Jim, and it's a pleasure to be here. Brad, thank you for hosting us here. That's a very pertinent question, and I think it goes back to one of the hinge moments in in modern history, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was then the foreign editor and made my way to Berlin on November 9th, 1989. And there was this tremendous outpouring of relief and support and joy across Europe as these democratic revolutions had taken place. And Francis Fukuyama, the political historian, wrote that this was the end of history because it showed the triumph of democracy. And there was this jubilation that, as you said, the George H.W. Bush administration declared we had succeeded in making Europe whole and free. And the feeling was that Europe was on its way to becoming a truly united continent. And initially, Francois Mitterrand, the French president, and Chancellor Kohl decided we need to make a great leap forward in three areas. One, to make sure that, to reassure the French that Germany would not use its greater powers as a united, the East and West Germany becoming the most populous and strongest country in Europe, that it would be bound to Europe through a single currency. They set a timetable for 10 years to do that. Then, even though a lot of economists were warning, this has a lot of pitfalls because there's no fiscal unity that would enable for transfers. Secondly, they decided to show that common citizens would benefit from this through a borderless Europe. The Schengen Treaty that opened up free travel across national borders. And lastly, the decision to embrace the new democracies and expand the European Union and NATO to the borders of Russia. And at the time, all three of these ideas seemed sound, sensible, and replete with the democratic values that we held. Germany, in particular, wanted expansion of NATO and the EU because they didn't want to be the easternmost Western democracies. So these three initiatives were launched, and now they have come back to haunt us. In each of these cases, the euro crisis, which has led to Greece almost being forced out because of its debt problems, the refugee crisis, which was triggered by the fact that Europe opened up its borders without securing its periphery. And now we see the resurgence of an aggressive, belligerent Russia taking revenge and trying to reverse history, as Vladimir Putin has said. And it's remarkable that he sensed that this was the issue that would resound in his favor in terms of his popularity, because despite the weak Russian economy, he has close to 90% support. So there was, we in a way sowed the seeds of our own problems. So now we have to deal with the consequences of what seemed to be sensible policies at the time, and it was under the guidance of the United States. I still believe that the achievement of bringing all of Germany into NATO and embracing the new democracies and making sure that there was a peaceful dissolution, a peaceful end to the Cold War, was one of the greatest diplomatic achievements in American history. And I think President Bush Sr., Brent Scowcroft, James Baker deserve a lot of credit for that. But they could not have foreseen at the time the consequences that this was going to lead. I think in retrospect, more should have been done to draw Russia in a more collaborative way.
Well, we'll talk for a minute, continue to talk for a minute about Russia and Vladimir Putin's designs on, ambitions toward Europe. We have something like 100,000 Russian troops right now staging exercises on NATO's borders in the Baltics. How far is Putin prepared to push his military objectives? And secondly, talk a little bit about the Russian involvement in this big election year in Europe, and whether or not there's the kind of meddling that we've seen in the American election, in the two big elections in Europe, which you cover very well in your book, the French election you cover very well, and we have the German election coming up in just a few weeks. So talk about Russia's role in both of those.
Right. Well, first, right now, about 100,000 Russian troops are gathering in and around Belarus, near the borders with Poland and the Baltic states. This created a lot of nervousness in those countries, because in past times these military exercises are conducted every 4 years, and in recent times they have been a prelude to Russian aggression elsewhere. 4 years ago it was a prelude to what they were doing in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. Before that, it was the incursion into Georgia and securing the northern regions there. So the fear is that Putin will use this opportunity at a moment of what he perceives as American weakness and distraction to press his luck. I don't think he will go as far as using military actions, because as we have seen with the meddling in our election and in the attempted meddling in the French election, and still to be seen what happens in Germany, Russia has developed a form of hybrid warfare. We saw the information warfare, the fake news, the use of social media in a very alarming way, the use of these hackers who broke into the DNC accounts, and the attempt to influence the French election, which, to their credit, the French were very well prepared for it, and they were able to thwart these efforts. But what works in Russia's favor right now is the fact that there is so much confusion and distortion about news, and the fact that, let's say in the Baltic states, there are many ethnic Russians who feel that they have not been allowed to have full voting rights and full civil rights, and they are getting their news and interpretation of the world through Russian media. Russia media is much more sophisticated than it was in the Cold War days. And I think Putin and people around him have been surprised at how effective they have been, first in meddling in our election, and now they're trying to press their luck in elsewhere in Europe. They failed in France, and the mystery has been, why have they have not managed to meddle in Germany? Well, we have about 10 more days before the German election. What is most disconcerting and worrisome to the Germans is that about 8 months ago, there was a massive hacking attack on the Bundestag, the German parliament, and a break-in of classified information on the intelligence committee. And it was assumed that it was traced to the same kind of hackers who were involved in the democratic hacking attempt. What will happen is they have this material. Some of it is very sensitive, and the fear has been that they will use it at a very opportune time. Could be very close to the election. We'll see in the next 10 days or so. But this is a worrisome development, and I think it sort of foreshadows the problems that we are going to face in the future. It's not going to be overwhelming numbers of tanks or nuclear weapons that determine superiority in warfare. It's going to be cleverness and nimbleness, because in a way this form of asymmetric warfare has now been adopted by Russia in its dealings with the West. And partly it's because the internet, which was first seen as a powerful tool of spreading democracy, has now become a powerful tool for autocrats to use and distort and confuse people.
When you read Bill Drozdiak's book, which I trust you will be tempted to conclude that Bill Drozdiak knows Angela Merkel better than any foreign journalist. That's certainly an impression I've formed over the years in listening to Bill. Talk a little bit about Merkel, how she's done in this campaign. A year ago, it did not look nearly as certain as it does now that she will win a fourth term. What do you expect her to do about Germany's problems in that fourth term? And give us a sense of what it means for the rest of Europe.
Well, I think a lot of people would agree that Angela Merkel is now the most prominent and respected democratic leader in the world. I've come to acquire enormous respect for her. I've gotten to know her over the last 20 years. Initially, not so much as a journalist, but when I was working at the American Council on Germany, we developed a young leader program that was cultivating the next generation. And she was a very strong supporter of this. And we spoke often about the need to cultivate an understanding across the Atlantic for the next generation that would not have the memories of World War II in their minds, and how this could be most effective. And she was quite moving in talking about her own background and why it was important for her. The first time she was able to travel in the West was out to the Pacific coastline and looking out on the beautiful aquamarine waters of La Jolla. And she thought, that she had arrived in paradise. And so she has always had tremendous respect and admiration for the United States, not least because when the wall came down, she was able to enter politics as the first woman from Eastern Germany to join the cabinet of Helmut Kohl. Merkel has been put in a very difficult position. Germany is still very uncomfortable about exercising power and the fact that it is the dominant country in Europe. And she told me on more than one occasion, France's weakness is Germany's problem. And her predecessor, Helmut Kohl and Gerhard Schroeder, and Helmut Schmidt had all had strong French partners, and Europe moved ahead thanks to this French-German tandem. In her 12 years in power, she's had two very weak French presidents with whom she just didn't get along. So they were unable to act as an equal partner. Now she's very hopeful that Macron will be somebody that she can work with. So she was, and I try to portray this in the opening chapter, which is called Berlin, the new epicenter of power, that how reluctantly she grasped this leadership that was thrust into her hands. First, in terms of making the demands on Greece to shore up its economy in a way that would justify investing so much money in offering billions of dollars in new loans. Secondly, in taking the lead, partly because President Obama did not want to do it. He thought it was time for Europe to assume greater responsibility, taking the lead and dealing with Putin on the Ukraine issue. And since she speaks flawless Russian and had a long-standing, if tense, relationship with Putin, she was sort of the designated figure of the West in pushing this through. And then finally, the refugee crisis that you mentioned. I explained this at some length because I think it tells you a lot about her nature and her background. She grew up as the daughter of a Lutheran pastor who cared for, who ran a disabled center in Eastern Germany. And she said that every day she was reminded how important it was to care for people who needed it. And when she woke up on September 4th, 2015, she saw that there were thousands of people stranded in the Budapest train station. It was a Saturday morning. She couldn't reach other leaders. She had then and there, she had been contacted by her ambassador and other people there, said these people are at the breaking point. You need to make a decision now. And she decided, okay, send them on to Germany. And it was that decision which was very much against her nature. She's a very cautious person. They even have turned her name into a verb. To Merkel means to procrastinate. Just take one tiny step forward and to look all around and make sure and see how everybody is responding, and then you make a timid little step forward. Well, in this case, it was bold, even reckless, and people were astounded that Merkel would do this kind of thing. But she said later on, I would still do the same. It was a humanitarian decision. It was very consistent with the way she had been brought up in her father's household. And when she was confronted with the consequences at the first European summit that occurred about within a month of the release of these refugees, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, said, Chancellor Merkel, you are going to regret this. I am building barbed wire fences all around my country, and you will be forced to do the same around Germany. And she dropped her papers and said, Mr. Prime Minister, I grew up staring at a wall in my face, and I'm determined that I will never see that happen again in Europe. And it was a very moving and compelling moment that all the other leaders were remarked upon.
She's a remarkable leader. One of the most remarkable photographs you have in your book is of Angela Merkel, who as a child was bitten by a dog, I think attacked by a dog, and has a fear of dogs as a result, sitting beside Vladimir Putin, who is bringing into the room a big black Labrador dog, knowing full well the history. And Merkel sits there stifling the panic that she seems to be feeling. that tells you a lot about both of those two leaders. We've talked about Russia.
But just so I can add, Putin then said, "Oh, I had no idea that she had this phobia." And as a way of apologizing, I would like to make a gift of the dog to Chancellor Merkel.
Exactly. So we've dealt with Russia. Let's deal with the other superpower that the Europeans have to deal with in one way or another, the United States. The Trump administration hasn't paid a lot of attention to Europe, and the attention that is paid hasn't been totally positive, I would submit. And the Europeans, and Merkel in particular, has said as a result, we have to rely on ourselves much more. One of your concluding chapters is called Post-America Europe. What does that mean? How would are the Europeans capable of charting their own course, and what would that course look like?
Well, I think the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House has accelerated this recognition in Europe that perhaps the time has come for us to, as she said, take our destiny in our own hands. And whether Europe is capable of doing this is still questionable. But I think there is a feeling that is becoming widespread in Europe that it is unhealthy for us to continue depending on American security guarantees the way we have done for the past 70 years. And when you look back over the course of human history, you see what an anomaly this is. There's been no previous situation where a wealthy continent like Europe had basically outsourced its security and protection to another power for so long, for 70 years. Shorter period, maybe. But now I think there's a realization that, and it's been coming for some time. I think it began with the George W. Bush administration when there was angry refusal by Gerhard Schroeder in Germany and Jacques Chirac in France to follow America's lead into Iraq. They warned us that this was a big mistake, and we disregarded them. And so the feeling has set in Europe that we should no longer blindly follow the Americans through their leadership of NATO into these misbegotten ventures, whether it be in Iraq or Afghanistan. And we need to chart our own course according to our own values. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think it's a very precarious and dangerous situation. I would like to see the United States stay involved, maybe not in the way it has in the past, but certainly to help provide leadership and guidance. Because one of my good friends and mentors in the past, Richard Holbrooke, who died about 5 years ago. I used to have many conversations with him, and Dick's view was that America is fundamentally a European power, and unless America takes a firm and decisive role in managing crises in Europe, as he finally did in terms of the Balkan crisis that had festered for years and failed diplomatic initiatives by both Europeans and Americans, leading to 200,000 people dead. And then finally it was decisive American diplomacy and firepower that brought that to an end. And I think the same could be said for our failure on the Syria front, which led to this refugee crisis that we saw in 2015-16 threatened to destabilize Europe.
I'm going to ask you a question related to that as the last question from me. If those of you from the audience who want to ask Bill a question would take a position at either of the two microphones, the stand-up microphones that we have over there, we would appreciate it. You mentioned the refugee crisis, which is really brought into focus the problems that Europe faces perhaps in dealing with Islam, and particularly with radical Islam. But is there a European approach to Islam, its own Islamic populations? And how would you judge the success or failure of that approach to bringing about greater tranquility and civil rights?
Well, this is a very painful and difficult question, I think, for European leaders. We've seen the homegrown terrorism that's resulted from second, third, even fourth generation Muslim immigrants who were born and raised in Belgium, in France, who then participated in these terrible acts of terrorism. And I think Europeans have been asking themselves, what did we do wrong here? What was it? Was it the neglect of these communities? I think there's a lot of feeling that not enough was done to integrate them into positions of power, having more role models, affirmative action programs, if you will. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think there's a feeling of rejection on the part of these generations that against their parents, because these were people, let's say, who came from Morocco or Turkey. There haven't been a problem with the Turkish populations coming into Germany. It's mainly been with North Africans, and it's the first two generations came and wanted to integrate. And now it's been difficult for the third and fourth generations who feel alienated from the local culture, yet have no affinity for the home back there. And so, again, with the internet and these romantic videos about ISIS, they were sort of lured into this. So I don't know how you get out of this. The big concern is that a lot of these returning fighters will be sort of ticking time bombs for stability in Europe, but it's a serious problem that Europeans are going to have to grapple with for years to come.
Sir. Okay. I'm Mike Springman. I'm an attorney, author, political commentator, and former diplomat. I've got to take issue with just about everything you've said, but let me focus on Angela Merkel. She is a ruthless political operator. She was a mentee of Lothar de Maizière, the last non-communist leader of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. She was the protege of Helmut Kohl, and she also destroyed him. In de Maizière's case, she let out the information that it was his connection to the East German State Security Service, which toppled him from power, and he was next in line to succeed Helmut Kohl, whom she toppled by bringing out information on his double-dealing, financial fraud, and slush funds. You've talked about Russia. You've said they've had 100,000 soldiers on the march. I think the figure is really 10,000. You've ignored the American Operation Anaconda with 10,000 soldiers maneuvering in Poland. You've missed out on the two Dragoon rides, where you had hundreds of American armored vehicles and thousands of American soldiers riding around the borders of Russia. You've glossed over the issues of the illegal aliens that have been carefully herded from the bombed out, destroyed, destabilized, and deculturalized countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And Merkel has brought them into Germany as serfs, as slaves, to do what they're doing here. 800,000 free labor, people willing to work for almost nothing for any advantage. And this has been done very carefully with the assistance of the security services.
Was there a
The
question?
question is, give us some facts instead of opinions. Okay?
Do you want to
Well,
respond?
well, I could try to respond to. I disagree with practically everything you said on that score. The last point, well, the 800,000 refugees are not serfs. Those who are offered jobs, only 9% of them have been integrated into the workforce, and that's a problem. Merkel has said we would like to help them learn German and become part of the working force, because we have a labor shortage. Now, if they don't want to do so, Germany is happy to fly them back to where they came from.
Maybe we can get a comment from an independent observer who's standing at the microphone next, or put your question.
No, yeah. I'll only observe that Mr. Springman appears to have been. Yeah, thank you. I'm Norman Birnbaum. Mr. Springman appears to be closely following the electoral line of the somewhat hapless Linke Partei, or Left Party, party in Germany. But
And your question.
I want to ask something else.
Thank you.
While saying that Merkel's Lutheranism and familial religious inheritance is quite important, as Bill pointed out. In the years of the Cold War, much of the support for the United States in Europe, across a very broad band of opinion, was due to the success of what could be called the American model of society. That is, the United States, its egalitarianism, its pluralism, its freedoms of political activity were greatly admired, not the least by the European left, which thought of the Berkeley Revolt as a great model. Needless to add, Donald Trump would have some difficulty in equaling this ideological triumph. But at the same time, there was a good deal of talk about a European model of society, which would integrate pluralistic democracy with a very strong state role in the economy, would later develop participatory democracy. All of that is the notion of an original European contribution to a common future, appears to be in suspension, if not extreme disrepair. How come, and what chances of revival do you see?
Sorry, I missed the welfare state. You want me to address that?
Well,
the
the
European model?
of
A European
socialization.
model of society, which began with environmentalism, the welfare state,
Right.
and extended from the Christian social parties through the liberals to good parts of the left.
Right, right. Well, I think in some cases it has been remarkably successful. If you read the chapter on Denmark, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how they have managed to achieve a degree of prosperity and security that is envied around the world. And one of the reasons is they have invested a huge amount in self-reinvention and job retraining. For example, Danes, on a proportional basis, spend 18 times as much as we Americans do on job retraining. 1 in 4 Danes changes jobs every year. And it's a way, so it's a social model that is built on saying, we will give you universal health care, free university education, but in return we expect you to do everything you can to work. So there's very little, few tales of welfare cheats, because they're forced to, in the Danish system, to learn a new trade and get back into the workforce. This is the kind of model that Emmanuel Macron says he is trying to impose on France. Whether he'll succeed or not is highly questionable, because it's a different culture. But I think that there is a growing recognition in Europe that being too generous with a lot of these social welfare benefits has undercut their entrepreneurial attitudes. I grew up in the Bay Area, and there are about 80,000 young French people who are now there, who have emigrated from France because they're so frustrated. And a lot of them have said now, for the first time under Macron, they're interested in going back. But the ones that I have spoken to out there said the reason we came is because of the entrepreneurial dynamism that we see in the United States, and the fact that it's more of a meritocracy and we don't have to wait 20 years to climb our way up the ladder to achieve success.
We're running very short on time, so I'm going to take two questions from the first two people on this side of the room.
Hi, my name is Samira Daniels, and I've been quite interested in the response to the refugees in Germany. My family is part German too, but I was surprised at your comment on how the German society is, viewing the refugee, because in the 80s. They were already anticipating a larger refugee for its own, it was aging population, so it's that. But I want to take issue with Mr. Hoagland's question, and if you could answer this. I don't see, the political counselor from Germany was here at Georgetown, and she claimed that they were not afraid of the terrorist threat there, because it was, it was anecdotal and so forth, and when the Germans for the most part felt safe with the refugees. So I'm wondering, where do you, what is the source of your concern? What is the source of the response you gave when
Well, no.
Let's get the second question and
Okay.
then bunch your responses.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for being here. Jim, you didn't mention Brexit at all in terms of the
counting on
conversation. I know you were counting on me. I'm curious as to how you would approach Brexit from a finance perspective. In other words, London no longer potentially being the center within Europe, and the likelihood that finance will be moving to Frankfurt, for instance, as a perspective, and as a result, Germany becoming even stronger. A second question with respect to Mr. Macron at this point. Seemingly he had a high degree of popularity a couple of months ago. His popularity has surged downward in far greater depth than even Mr. Trump at this point. And I was wondering if you could address Mr. Macron's popularity at this point, and what do you think in terms of going forward?
Okay, in rapid succession on the refugee issue, very few, if any, that I'm aware of terrorist attacks have occurred from refugees. As I mentioned, these are homegrown. These were Europeans, and particularly in the Molenbeek area of Brussels. These are second and third generation who were born and raised in those countries, and the same in France. So I think it's more the alienation that these younger people feel. The refugees have actually, by and large, been very grateful for the way they've been treated, and have been, under difficult circumstances, very well behaved. The first question was on Frankfurt. Yeah, the impact of Brexit. Well, I think the Frankfurt is the natural place where a lot of the financial institutions will gravitate because of the presence of other banks and the European Central Bank. But I think the issue to watch for is what will happen to these trade patterns. If they cut off a customs union with Britain, it's going to create enormous economic hardship for France, Belgium, Netherlands along that coastline, and that's going to endanger the fragile economic recovery that we've seen in Europe recently. So this is going to be a very difficult negotiation. I don't think the question of London losing its status as a financial center is going to be hurt, no question about that. And some of that will transfer, but I'm more worried about the impact on trade and living standards in Europe longer term, because this clearly feels, if you have, as we've seen in the last 10 years, the economic recession in much of Europe fueled the rise of these populist nationalists. Not everywhere. I mean, I mentioned Poland as the fastest growing economy, yet they've elected a populist nationalist government. So it doesn't always hold, but certainly in Greece, in the rise of the five-star movement in Italy, Podemos in Spain, the sense of desperation that a lot of young people in particular feel have driven them to the political extremes. And your last question was Macron, whether he will succeed. Well, I think his popularity, it was so exaggerated, it was bound to come down. But he got himself caught up over the summer in a couple of silly controversies. One, finding a formal role for his wife, which the French people did not like, and then spending 26,000 euros on makeup, which... but I think the key event today was that the strikes and labor protests were not as great as many people feared. So if he can ride this out and push through with these reforms, I think it's good news for France and Europe.
Question from here.
Hey, Bill. Thanks for doing the book. And
Great to see you.
Great to be here. So I was in London for most of August, and there's a lot of buyer's remorse there, but no political leadership that even could begin to find a way through this. Even the Labour Party, which has now disowned Brexit, nonetheless doesn't come up with anything. So put on, give us your crystal ball for a minute. I mean, what happens to the European project, if Britain has a sort of, let's say, breach birth with getting out with Brexit? Because as you know, the negotiations aren't going very well. The government's not very coherent in what they want in the UK, except pie in the sky. Is this going to end really badly?
Well, I think you're right. There is a lot of buyer's remorse, and particularly among the young people who failed to turn out in sufficient numbers. This, again, was a complication of bad judgment by David Cameron. He scheduled the referendum the week of the final exams for all university students in Britain, and the day before the biggest pop music festival at Glastonbury. So they were either out partying and celebrating, or they were studying for their exams, and they didn't turn out in very large numbers. And now it's the young people who are going to suffer, and they realize this. So they've come out and demanded a second referendum. You mentioned the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. He's playing a very cautious game because he realizes his stock has risen with the misjudgments of the Conservative Party. So he doesn't want to jeopardize the recent gains that he's had. So I think the best outcome would be if they proceed with these negotiations. They see it's going badly, and somebody, perhaps it could be Corbyn, makes a case saying we need to have a second referendum, a do-over. And this has happened in other countries. France did it, the Netherlands, and they after first rejecting the euro, they finally accepted it. This might be something that would happen, but in the British culture, that would be seen as an extreme move because it would be seen as tampering with democracy, even though it was a close vote, 52 to 48. And again, I think it's what I lament is the absence of strong-willed political leadership. It's not coming from Theresa May, and I don't think we see it from Jeremy Corbyn either.
So we have two final questions before we move to signing of books, which Bill will be happy to do here. So if you could make them concise.
Thank you for an interesting talk on an important subject. I think you said that one of the failures of American policy following the breakup of the Soviet Union was to not try to include Russia in the integration and creation of a free and democratic Europe. Do you think that can be reversible? Is there anything to entice Russia to join a democratic and free Europe is there anything we can offer them that makes it really desirable for them? And will there be correspondingly leadership that find these offers sufficiently attractive?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, very pertinent. And I can cite a conversation I had with Chancellor Merkel. I raised the same question with her. And she said, you know, in my conversation with Putin, the last year or so, she's had about 70 conversations. And one of which he said, you know, one of the proudest achievements of Germany is that we have built peaceful and prosperous relationships with all 9 of our neighbors. And Russia seems stuck in this mindset that they feel only secure when they can destabilize their neighbors. So they're trying to weaken the surrounding countries around them because they think that provides them with security. And she has pointed this out, and others have too, to the Russian leadership, not just Putin, but others, saying that your strategic interests lie with a better collaboration and cooperation with the West, because over time, you're facing population encroachment on your eastern border in Siberia by China, and it's already happening because the Russians don't have the troops to guard their border, and radical Islam in the south, which is coming up. And they already had an insurgency in Chechnya, which they put down with ruthless abandon. But that's going to come back to haunt them. So you would think if you were a Russian leader, a pragmatic assessment would be to look for help in the West. Instead, Putin has chosen the expeditious route, saying, I can boost my popularity by picking a fight with the West and making my people think, oh, whatever problems they have, it's all because the West is out to screw us.
You can make a lot of analogies saying the same thing about America and its paranoia and whatnot. And I'm thinking, as far as your title goes, and I've lived half my life in Europe, including working on a military base. Russia does not have all these military empire bases like we have. If we don't want refugees, either in Europe or in the United States or Canada or Australia, then the West needs to stop being an empire, lapdogs to this empire. Fragmentation, let's talk about fragmentation. Three jurisdictions can't sit at a table and fund a metro.
Yeah. Well,
And I'm going to sum up. Yeah, I'm getting to it. I'm going to sum because no, I understand, but I'm telling you, it's hard to get an independent thought in this country. NATO. Let's talk about post-World War II. The average European did not want NATO, which basically is an extension of our Department of Defense, to head to the east. This is the ruling class who wanted it. It is the ruling class, the banks, and the military warmongers, and this is what's happening. And one final thing about Greece, I suggest everyone in this room do research on who was giving loans to the Greek government that they knew they would not be able to pay back, just like the same banks and CEO decision makers were handing out subprime loans. This is called capitalism is desperate.
okay. Well, all right. Well, that's a statement, not a question, but I would only say that NATO has only moved into countries that invited support. Right? Well, I doubt it. Free democracies. Anything?
We have another question.
Yeah,
Have a question.
it is a question, I promise. The 2017 general election in the United Kingdom has been called kind of the young people's revenge for sitting Brexit out. I just wanted to know what your opinion of that was, and what the role of young people are going to be coming up in this continent that they were told is open, that they were told could be the United States of Europe, and has now probably in the next couple of years not going to live up to that. Thank you.
Well, I hope that the buyer's remorse that we've talked about in Britain is pushed by the young people, because George Bernard Shaw once said, you know, old people don't care what happens because they're about to die. It's the young people who will pay the price. And some of the things that the European Union has done, one of the great programs, I think, is the Erasmus program. 40,000 young people get to spend a year studying abroad, and this has created great friendships and a whole network, and it would be a tragedy to see young Brits who excluded from this. So I hope that I think they realize that their failure to vote has cost them dearly, and that they get a chance to renew the contacts and sustain them in the future.
We thank you for coming out tonight.